Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord. I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. You put your left arm up, right arm too. I'll tell you, baby, what you got to do. You just flap your arms and your feet start kicking. That's when you know you're doing the funky chicken. Hey, bam, bam, ba ba da ba, ba dum bam ba dum ba, bam ba ba da ba dum bam ba da. So this week is a rare week, listeners, and if you watch me on YouTube, I don't have on a white collared dress shirt and a tie. Lord Gord's been two-timing out here, but not with two women, but with two jobs. So I have to work hard to make ends meet and acquire capital so I can buy land and whatnot. So, unfortunately, I'm not in my professional attire as I'm coming from another job. But this week, I'm going to talk about a very important topic. I'm going to get into the housing boom and bust that happened, 10, 15 years ago. Just what led to it, what happened, the politics of it, and just refuting the mainstream narrative out there that it was deregulation and the bankers that did it. Long story short, it was really government. So let's get into some of the genesis of the housing boom and bust. So first and foremost, one of the biggest things involving the housing boom and bust was social justice. Listen to my podcast on the insidiousness of social justice. I recently finished Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. And so many fallacies of the left and just so many people in general is that they believe that equal distribution of results by population is the norm and unequal distribution is the exception, when I've seen literally no evidence that shows that results in a specific field are exactly proportional to the population. For example, more than 90% of American prisoners are male, but 90% of the American population isn't male. 3/4 of all K through 12 teachers in America are female. 3/4 of the population is not female. From 1975 onward, blacks have committed 52% of all murders in the United States. They're not 52% of the population. Blacks are 80% of NBA players. They're not 80% of the population. So on and so forth. So how that whole idea about discrimination and racism and whatever buzzword you want to throw out there causes disparities. This is one of the key things that led to the housing boom or bust, because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, privately owned but government sponsored enterprises that would buy loans from banks, mortgage loans from banks, so on and so forth, along with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, put extreme pressure on banks to make mortgage loans to what they called, quote unquote, the undeserved population. Read, the favorite pet minorities of the left, black and Hispanics. Not the Asians, because we're going to get into that later, why the Asians aren't part of the underserved population. By 1996, HUD wanted 40% of Fannie and Freddie's loan purchases to be devoted to affordable housing. And by 2006, it was 53%. Because studies in the 90s showed disparities in mortgage approval rates between whites and blacks. By 93, HUD began taking legal action against banks that had such disparities, leading to a lowering of lending standards. Because when you actually look at the data and you see that the majority of whites and blacks are approved for mortgages, but more blacks are declined than whites, the social justice types, as we'll get into, say racism. So we need to lower the standards for blacks so more of them get loans, even though the blacks were declined, had much poorer credit histories and much higher rates of default. We'll get into that later. And, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about has to do with a horrible law in the books called disparate impact. So disparate impact is a communist law in my mind, and essentially it says, even if you treat all groups equally, if one of these protected groups are disproportionately affected by the equal standards imposed on everyone, then that is deemed to be discrimination, and the government can come in and force people to make decisions they wouldn't have made and pay no price for doing so. And the burden would fall on the business, the taxpayers, so on and so forth, all for their utopian vision, which will never be realized. And every time it is attempted, it leads to mass starvation and genocide. Okay, so here we go. A 1991 study by the Federal Reserve System showed that for government-backed loans, the approval rate for blacks was 61% and for whites was 77%. For conventional loans, the approval rates were 56% and 76% respectively. The facts were that whites were turned down for loans at a higher rate than Asians and resorted to subprime mortgages more often than Asians. So according to Disparate Impact, they would have had to lower the standards for whites too, because whites would decline more than Asians. But it's dumb. It's nonsense. And this led to our whole economy crashing. Anyway, let's keep going. Because Fannie and Freddie were willing to buy the now risky loans that banks would make because of government regulation. Banks had every incentive to follow that mandate. While traditional 30-year mortgage loans were the majority of loans in 2001, they fell to only 33% of all loans by 2006. Subprime mortgage loans went from 7% to 19%. By 2006, more than 50% of subprime loans were liar loans, in which the borrower wasn't required to show proof of income. So in other words, say I wanted to get a house. I can go to the bank and say, I'm black. I can go to the bank and say, hey, I want a loan for a house. And they say, how much money you make? And I say, $100,000. They wouldn't ask you for any pay stubs, tax returns, anything. You can literally say whatever you want. There's a movie called The Big Short that talks about this, but The Big Short's Hollywood propaganda because it basically blames bankers and capitalism when it really was government. For example, the government put extreme pressure on these banks, and if you didn't follow their mandates, they could make it really hard for you to do mergers and to do business because governments have regulations over banks, so they would squeeze you. So the banks that didn't do it would more likely than not be squeezed out of existence because of government pressure. They wouldn't be able to expand. They wouldn't be able to make certain business deals. They'd get lawsuits, so on and so forth. So it really was the government behind all this. And people say, oh, it was greed that did it. I mean, were the bankers in 2005 greedier than they were in 1950 or 1960 when even in 2001, where the majority of loans were 30-year fixed mortgages? The reality is that banks want to get their money back. You don't lend a substantial amount of money to people who don't pay you back. That's stupid. That's how you go out of business. So who was behind it? Government. And whose money were they using to bet on this nonsense? Our money, the taxpayers' money. We had to cover this. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But let's talk about this. Politicians clamoring for affordable housing were found on both sides of the aisle, but mostly from Democrats. People like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd ignored warnings about the growing riskiness in housing markets and continued to push for affordable housing. Barney Frank, quote, wanted to roll the dice on Fannie and Freddie, and Congress people like Joe Baca saw that a rise in interest rates hurt black and Hispanic lenders, so he crusaded on keeping interest rates artificially low. When George W. Bush expressed concern about the risk of Fannie and Freddie buying subprime mortgages, 76 Democrats in the House sent him a letter defending the government-sponsored enterprises, federal-backed securities, and government regulations that caused prices in certain left-wing cities to spike. And really where a lot of the foreclosures happened were California and other left-wing cities where they had laws that inhibited the development of housing, causing housing prices to spike. Places like San Francisco, LA, San Diego, so on and so forth. You had places like Dallas and Houston without zoning laws, and even during this whole housing boom, the prices relatively stayed the same. But in places like San Francisco, in San Jose, and Palo Alto, the prices were just shooting up. And the thing was, during this housing boom, Since so many people who weren't able to get houses were getting houses, you had people building houses, you had people investing in houses. They take out equity loans in housing because the prices were shooting up, shooting up, shooting up, right? But then the thing was, once all these subprime borrowers defaulted, as one would have thought, there are so many houses on the market that the value of houses plummeted because there are so many empty houses out there. So people who are investing in flipping houses, if you sold that house in time, you made yourself a lot of money. But I remember seeing this NFL player who, like, during the housing boom had bought this house, and then when the whole bubble exploded, the price of his house declined significantly, but because he had signed the mortgage for the initial price, he still had to pay that mortgage, even though his house, the value of his house had dropped by like 50%. And this was all caused by government. So, the government backs the securities with our money, and they force the banks to make these bad loans, and when they default, boom, everything just blows up. So I'm going to read, before I get to the outcome, I'm going to read some of the facts that didn't make it to the leftist press involving black lenders, because when this whole thing blew up, you had these Congress people playing the American people like fools, getting the bankers up there and saying, "You're a racist. Blacks disproportionately got these subprime loans, which are horrible loans. These no money down loans. These fixed interest rate loans, and they could only have the house for a year or two, but the rate shot up. How could you do this? You're so evil." They were the ones responsible for having the banks lower their standards, because they told the banks, because of these disparities, you're a racist. And if you keep holding these people to the same standards as everyone else, then we're going to punish you. We're going to sue you. We're going to make sure you can't do business, so on and so forth. So they created the mess that the bankers found themselves in, and then they turned around and blamed the bankers for racism. So this was a paper, this was in an op-ed column in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with these facts. Among blacks, 52% have credit scores that would classify them as subprime borrowers. In other loans, their credit scores suck because they don't pay people back. In Metro Atlanta, 49% of blacks wind up with a subprime mortgage. Again, because their credit scores are garbage because they don't pay people back. Among whites, 16% have managed their personal credit so poorly that they'd be classified as a subprime borrower. There it is. Why you're classified as a subprime borrower is because your personal credit is horrible. In metro area Atlanta, 13% of whites end up with subprime mortgages. Without questions, more blacks than Hispanics, more Hispanics than whites, and more whites than Asians use subprime loans to buy a house. So if racism was the cause, why were more whites getting subprime loans than Asians? They never had to answer it because the facts are never brought up, because the mainstream press is leftist and they sided with these leftist politicians. They use taxpayer dollars to buy votes. And then when the whole thing blew up, they knew that all they had to do was blame capitalism and blame bankers and blame Jews, and the people would eat it up. So it was a win-win for people like Barney Frank and Chris Dodd. They created this whole mess, and then when it blew up, this is due to a lack of regulation. We need more regulation to help us stop a crisis like this. You created the crisis, you moron. And I got most of this information, Housing Boom and Bust by Thomas Sowell. Read this book. It's incredible. Breaks it down with facts and logic. So let's break down some of the stuff that happened, man, after this whole thing blew up. Quotes from the book. That private financial institutions, which were risking their own money, were reluctant to continue extending credit as freely as before under dire new conditions, while government-sponsored enterprises that could pass their risk onto the taxpayer were still going full steam ahead was not surprising, much less a reason for congratulating them for getting deeper, ultimately requiring hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts. So, taxpayers funded these subprime loans, and then when they blew up in their face, which a bunch of people predicted, the taxpayers were on the hook again, being treated like cattle for growing the leftist voting bloc, okay? The bailouts of Fannie and Freddie Mac will cost the taxpayers more than the bailouts of B of A, Citigroup, Chase, and Wells Fargo combined. Here's a quote from an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. In any other business, Mr. Dodd, Chris Dodd, would be begging for forgiveness. But in politics, the ability to brazen out your mistakes can be a crucial skill for the survival of your career. Yeah, you just double down, because no one's going to hold you accountable for this garbage, okay? Here it is. Another quote from the book. The rationale of the first bailout, TARP, was to prevent more financial institutions from collapsing, which would reduce the availability of credit on which demand, output, and employment depended. As of February 2009, the largest recipients of TARP money included J.P. Morgan Chase, $25 billion, Wells Fargo, $25 billion, AIG, $40 billion, B of A, $45 billion, and Citigroup, $50 billion. And remember, the bailouts for Fannie and Freddie, the privately owned but government-backed institutions that purchase all these bad loans from these banks, which they force them to make in the name of social justice, inequality, and affordable housing. It costs more money to bail them out than all those banks I named combined. And just looking at these numbers, that's 50, 100. That's like 185 billion. So it costs more to bail out Fannie and Freddie. It costs more than 185 billion dollars to bail out Fannie and Freddie. Thanks, big government. Another one, the stimulus package. Obama came in and tried to do a FDR Great Depression #2. Listen to my podcast on the fascism of FDR. How his big government totalitarian policies were inspired by socialists and fascists of Europe and helped extend the Great Depression by several years. They thought they'd copy this again. The taxpayers are on the hook hundreds of billions of dollars for I wouldn't even say the era. Those government elites made that decision on purpose in order to buy votes with our money. So not only were we on the hook for more than $185 billion for Fannie and Freddie plus the banks, there was a stimulus package, quote unquote. And the stimulus package, here are the facts, man. Here it is, in the Wall Street Journal, under the headline, Bank Lending Keeps Dropping. April 2009, quote, the biggest recipients of taxpayer aid made or refinanced 23% less in new loans in February, the latest available data, than in October, the month the Treasury kicked off the Troubled Asset Relief Program known as TARP, close quote. October 2009, economists reported that credit extended by American banks declined from $7.14 trillion in May to $6.78 trillion in September. So, the government program, which is built on stealing from the taxpayers and giving to those that don't belong, which require credible taxes, all kinds of rules and regulations that make it more costly to do business, didn't help the situation at all. The velocity of circulation of money in the economy as a whole fell faster than it had in 50 years, close quote. So, just to sum this up for you guys. Mortgage lending is fine. Of course, blacks are getting declined more than whites, even though majority are being approved. The blacks are getting declined, or they're getting declined for the same reason that whites and Hispanics are getting declined, poor credit histories, higher risk of default, so on and so forth. It's just that more blacks are bad with money. The social justice crowd, the communist crowd runs with it, says this is due to discrimination and racism. Even though this is true at black banks, the same trend is true. Passes all of this government regulation to force banks to make very risky loans to them because, 30-year convention mortgage loans are racist, according to these communists. The federally backed Fannie and Freddie Mac buys these extremely risky loans from the banks because so many people are getting loans. There's a huge increase in the supply of housing in major cities, left-wing cities all across the country with rent control, open growth laws, smart growth laws. The houses are extremely expensive, so the housing boom was concentrated in these areas. That's where the price kept going up. Once the whole bubble pops, there's so many, and a bunch of these people who banks knew were bad people to lend to, they start defaulting, they walk away. The whole thing crumbles. There's so many houses on the market that people who had houses, they lose an incredible amount of money because you're stuck paying a mortgage for a house that's now worth half of what you signed up for. so on and so forth. You get the government to stake even more money from the taxpayers to bail out people who they put in this bad spot. And they end up doing worse than before, and the economy doesn't recover. So, just to sum up, seems like when you give the government an incredible amount of power to make decisions that they pay no price for, bad things happen. That is one of the biggest stories of the 20th century. It's a big story now, but what you hear in the media and the movies is that the bankers are greedy, they take advantage of poor people, so on and so forth, but it wasn't true. It was the government buying votes using our money, and they crashed our economy and our housing market. And markets all over the world that were buying these securities that were garbage. And that was mostly due to the government. So, there you have it. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. Leave a comment. Leave a review. Share with your friends. Let's get this thing going. Get the Lord Gord Funk album. This Isn't TV. iTunes, Spotify, Google Play. Watch the music video. Leave My Curl Alone on YouTube. Share it with a friend. Get your dance on. Let's do that. Next week, I'm going to talk about a concert that I've been looking for years. I only had 3 songs from the concert video, and I had the sound, the audio recording from this from the concert. But somehow, in some way, I landed my hands on this landmark concert in my eyes. It was the last concert that the Time did for more than 4 years, on February 3rd, 1991, in Yokohama, Japan, in promotion for the last album they did under the name of the Time, Pandemonium. Just going to talk about that, the implications of it, what it means to me. It's going to be a fun one. I'm going to give you guys some clips of this concert as well, so it should be great. I'm Lord Gord. I'll talk to you next time.